Freediving is a mirror for the way that we would want to respond to stress in our day-to-day lives. You're put into intimate contact with yourself to take control of both your mind and your body.
My name is Will Trubridge. I'm a professional freediver and so far the deepest human being on this planet.
You are put into contact with what it really means to exist, just pure consciousness. The exploration of yourself can reveal these hidden pearls just the same way that the ocean has so many hidden physical treasures. The interesting thing about freediving is that it is this test tube experiment in extreme stress management. In other sports, you can channel that adrenaline, that nervousness, the anxiety, all into the performance itself, but not so in freediving. Basically what I've done is transcribe these techniques, mental and physical, into a system that can be used by anyone, but you can access the potential of the breath itself and the mind in order to remain in a place of calmness.
Welcome to the FitMind Podcast, where we bridge ancient wisdom and modern science. Today, we have an extraordinary guest, Will Trubridge, a world champion freediver and a true master of the mind. He has dedicated his life to exploring the depths of the ocean on a single breath, holding the world record for diving to 102 meters, that's over 350 feet without fins. Freediving is an incredible test tube experiment in stress management. William's physical feats are a result of his incredible mental discipline, as he has learned to stay calm under immense pressure. He shares the mental techniques he developed to control his nervous system and manage stress, including the importance of a mantra like "now is all" and the dangers of scenario thinking. We also delve into the science behind the mammalian dive reflex and the Bohr effect, exploring how his training allows him to access and conserve oxygen more efficiently. Join us as William shows us how to navigate the abyss of our inner world and find peace in any situation. Without further ado, I give you William Trubridge. Well, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Josh.
Oh, it's amazing to have you here. I'm an avid freediver myself, and I'm super excited to chat. You've dedicated your life to exploring the depths of the ocean on a single breath. For anyone that doesn't know, could you briefly explain what freediving is?
Yeah, simplest terms, it's basically just taking a breath and going under the water. In competition, we go as far as we can, whether that's for depth or for distance in the pool, on that single breath. And you're using either fins, or the discipline I prefer is no fins, where you're just using your hands and feet to propel yourself.
Yeah, completely unassisted, and I look forward to chatting more about that. So in your book, well, actually throughout your life, you've had, I would say, an extremely colourful and interesting life. Could you take us back to the beginning? Like, what was your first memory of the ocean?
First memory, it's kind of just a patchwork of different memories that merge into themselves, like interminable distances on the boat when we're doing these long passages between, Panama and Galapagos, or Galapagos to the Marquesas Islands. And we were weeks at sea, and you get into this kind of timeless rhythm, and the rhythm of the ocean, the waves. I mean, being that far out to sea, it feels like the waves are very different. The kind of long ocean swells that carry boats along, and something magical, timeless about that. And those are the earliest memories that I have.
What sort of, because you grew up on a boat, what sort of age were you when you set off on that trip?
I was 20 months, so just
Wow.
shy of 2 when we left. We sold everything in the north of England to buy the boat and sail from Europe across the Atlantic, through the Caribbean, through the Panama, through the Pacific. And we stopped off in places. We were a year in the British Virgin Islands and a year in Tahiti. And so I don't remember when we left. I was too young. but my earliest memories were somewhere on the way, like somewhere maybe in the Caribbean or um, in the Pacific. So it's kind of like I emerged from that. That's my earliest recollections were always of the life on the water, in the water.
So you would have had no memory. Your earliest memory would be on the ocean.
Exactly, yeah. I learned to swim at about the same time as I was learning to walk. Uh, and yeah, we just spent all day when we're anchored next to some atoll or island. Myself and my brother would spend all day in the water on the beach, looking for shells, snorkeling. And so it was our playground, it was our school, it was our highway, of course, it was our supermarket, we'd get fish and lobster. And yeah, just our whole world, really.
When did freediving emerge then? I assume you were already starting to swim down and grab whatever's on the bottom of the ocean at that point.
Yeah, we were. And it depends how you define freediving. We were snorkeling and we were going deep for kids. When I was 8 and my brother was 10, we both went down to 15 meters. And this is with
Wow.
the worst kind of gear for freediving, like big fishbowl masks, short, stubby plastic fins, no wetsuit, of course. And we didn't know anything about technique, let alone relaxation. So we're just kind of like wriggling away on the surface, gasping a breath, charging down, grabbing a handful of sand or a rock or something, and then coming up and like ripping our mask off on the way up um, as we came to the surface. So that was, I guess, the earliest free dives. But it wasn't until a lot later. We sold the boat when I was 10. I went to school in New Zealand, went to high school, university, um, and then a year after university, left to do an OE, lived in London for a year, and then I found out about the sport of freediving. I heard through a friend that there was a sport where you could challenge yourself to go as deep as possible, and it just kind of rung a bell for me. I was like, I want to try that. So I saved up and went for a holiday to the Caribbean, to Belize and then Honduras, and spent just every day back in the water. I'd go out with the diving boats and morning and afternoon and just be there diving next to the scuba divers, but freediving, of course. Shallow at first and then getting progressively deeper as I kind of started to learn the techniques.
Do you think that from doing it from such a young age, you had already some adaptation? You must have had some,
I
I'd
don't
imagine.
think any physiological adaptation,
Mm.
but perhaps mentally, I found myself at home under the water. It was a natural place for me to be, and some kind of natural aquaticity from being a kid and spending so much time in the water. So there would have been that, but no physiological adaptation in the form of, I don't know, adapted red blood cells or muscle tissue or anything along those lines. Like when I first tried to hold my breath, when I heard about freediving, I was like, okay, let's give this a go. Laid down in bed, and I managed like 2 minutes 20, and I felt like I was dying, which is a very ordinary, normal time for someone when they hold their breath first time. It took me a while to get to 3, and a lot longer to get to 4, and eventually 5. And so my progression was very natural and ordinary for someone who's doing the kind of training that I was.
That's interesting. I'm sure that would be good to hear for a lot of beginners that are doing breath holds.
Mm.
Is why is it that we free dive? What's for anyone that hasn't done it, and many will be listening now. What is the feeling? What is the experience that happens?
Said we only have an hour though. There's so many answers I can give to that. There's so many directions you can take to, because there's this element of exploration of the underwater world, and I mean it's a completely different world, right? There's these incredible marine creatures, some of which are incredibly intelligent, in some ways more intelligent than us, and all the other like plethora of life that's just so different to what it is above the surface. So there's the exploration of that, but then there's also the exploration of yourself that can happen under the water. When you dive and you free dive, you're put into kind of intimate contact with yourself. You have to in order to be able to take control of both your mind and your body. And also, in addition to that, you are put into contact with what it really is, what it really means to exist, like what we are in the very, very center, deep, far, far in, which is just pure consciousness. And this is something that I talk about in the mental immune system and a lot of the talks I give, is that everything that else on top of that, the ego, the senses, the thoughts, the memories, the hopes, the affectations, everything is just contents to your consciousness. And that's something that was revealed to me through freediving, through these deep hangs that I would do at 50, 60 meters. So yeah, the exploration of yourself can reveal these hidden pearls just the same way that the ocean has so many hidden physical treasures. And then on top of that, all of that, there's just this beautiful sensation to it. The sensation of flying without wings, just being able to move in any direction in three-dimensional space, unencumbered, like a marine creature. And it's something that's just so far removed from any experience that you have above the surface, because above the surface, we're anchored by gravity to the surfaces, to the surface of the floor of the earth, to the surface of the sea, maybe in wingsuit jumping or a few other different activities, you escape that for a few seconds. But only in freediving can you be kind of completely unencumbered by that, by the gravity and by the sense of being anchored to a surface.
Yeah, it's aptly named, I think. Free diving for many reasons. You can also jump in for free. It's free diving.
Although it does get expensive when you're
That's true.
traveling, and the gear can be not cheap as well. But yeah, no, it's definitely the most free aquatic sport, I would say, in the sense that it's purely aquatic. Like I often talk about how every other aquatic sport you can think of takes place on the boundary on that surface between liquid and gas. And most of the kind of important stuff, like in sailing or water polo or rowing or windsurfing, all these other aquatic sports, it's all happening above the surface, right? Maybe in swimming, it's half above the surface, half under, but only freediving has 100% immersion, where the whole performance from start to finish happens in only the aquatic world, underwater.
Yeah, I think I remember you saying that from the TEDx talk or your book. Yeah, beautifully put. So you've described and the deep as a place of stillness and subtraction. What is it? What are the stages of diving to over 100 meters? Like you've done 102 meters dynamic no fin, which it might be worth us actually defining what DNF is as well before we jump into what it was like to do that dive.
Sure. Dynamic is actually the discipline in the pool. So that's where you're going for maximum distance, swimming backwards and forwards in the pool. And I've done just over a couple of 100 meters there. The world record is 250. But my specialty is depth, which is called constant weight no fins, CNF. And in that specialty, I've been to 102 meters, which is obviously a 204-meter round trip.
Which is incredible.
So yeah, that record was set in 2016, and it's the discipline, as I mentioned, that I've been training for my whole career. I've also done world records in other disciplines, but it's the one that I see as being kind of pure human aquatic potential, because in the same way that like the 100-meter sprint is pure human speed, you don't think about the fastest man in the world being the guy who's gone the fastest on the bike or in a Formula One car. It's just the human body. How fast can it go? And so in freediving, that's no fins for me. It's just pure human aquatic potential.
Yeah, it is for me as well. Yeah, I mentioned DNF because I do almost entirely pool training. I'm based in Melbourne, but
Mm.
yeah, we don't have much depth around us. Yeah, thank you for the correction. But in terms of what that, I don't know if how well you remember that dive, but what was like, how did you feel before that dive? Like, how was it experientially? Like, what was the interoceptive or like internal awareness like as you were making that dive? Because I always, when I listen to the competitions before a free dive, it seems like quite a stressful environment. Like them shouting like top time, and it's quite, there's a lot going on. So yeah, I'm curious. Do you just get used to that? You must to an extent. And then what is the dive like?
Do get used to it, but only to a certain extent. It's always a different environment to how we train. For instance, when we train, it's just you and a handful of divers, and it's very chill, relax. Having the judges, the cameras, the media, uh, everyone else, spectators around, adds an extra element of pressure, and pressure causes stress, and stress accelerates the heart rate, accelerates the nervous system, so you burn oxygen more quickly, which makes it more difficult. So it's harder to perform in a record attempt or in a competition. And what made this one particularly difficult was the fact that in 2014, I had done, it was called in New Zealand the live dive. They were broadcasting a world record attempt that I was doing back to Breakfast TV in New Zealand. And it put a huge amount of pressure on me, and ultimately, not just because, not for that reason only, but I was unsuccessful in 2014.
Mm.
And afterwards, when I did the live interview back to New Zealand, I kind of stuck my foot in my mouth and said, because I was so overwhelmed by just the kind of the loyalty and um, the belief that the New Zealand public had shown in me, and wanted to, I guess, give something back for that. And so I said, I'm going to be back. I'm going to break this record. And the next time I break it, it's going to be dedicated to all of you who are watching here. And that was fine to say that then. But fast forward 2 years when the next attempt came round, and I was like, okay, well, I can't fail this time, because that just wouldn't fit in the narrative, right? It has to be successful. And so I had more pressure on me for that second attempt in 2016, and I really felt it. And at the whole, I'd say weeks out, the last kind of like month or so, as this date was coming up for the attempt, it was just all about developing mental techniques in order to stay calm and not let that pressure affect me.
Mm.
And afterwards, I kind of sat down with pen and paper and wrote down all the techniques that I'd been using in that period. And there was 7 different ones that I had, I guess, created specifically for that attempt. Like 7. There were not all of them were entirely new. Some of them were like variations of an original theme in terms of mental techniques, but they were all something different that I hadn't done before mentally, in order to put me in the right place to attempt that record. And that was the biggest difficulty of that dive, was just overcoming the pressure and being in complete control of the mind, and all the monkeys on your back.
Can you share any one of those mental techniques that, like, I wonder, do you use like a mantra or?
Yeah, so one of them was a mantra, and the mantra, like I've used many different mantras over the years. You kind of need to have an arsenal of them. And for this particular attempt, the one that I kind of came across and seemed to help was "now is all."
Mm.
So just reminding myself that there is only this present moment, and to focus on what I'm doing in this moment, whether it's driving to the blue hole, putting my wetsuit on, relaxing on the platform, like just do that and nothing else. Because we get sucked into, especially in these key moments, we get sucked into what I call scenario thinking, where we're thinking about what could happen. What would happen if I black out, if I'm unsuccessful again, if I let New Zealand down again, or what would happen if I'm successful? Like how cool would that be? And I would have the world record. And so you go down these rabbit holes of thinking about potential scenarios, potential futures, most of which won't happen. Like it'll always be slightly different to how you can imagine it. And so essentially you're hallucinating. You're hallucinating about things that will never come to pass. And in that hallucination, you are invariably affected by it physically and mentally. Like it changes your nervous system activation, it changes your thoughts. And so as soon as I recognize that I'm getting sucked into that kind of scenario thinking, then I would just remind myself, okay, now is all, just this moment. What are you doing right now? You're putting your wetsuit on, putting your lanyard on. Okay, just do that. Concentrate on doing that. Now concentrate on breathing, passive diaphragmatic breathing, relax. So just step by step, all the way up to the last breath. And then if I've achieved that, if I've only focused on what is in front of me for that entire half an hour, or even that whole morning before the dive, then the dive should be successful.
Yeah, amazing. It's interesting you said that, yeah, you're hallucinating. We had on Shamil Shandaria and Ruben Laukonen not too long ago, and they talk about like predictive processing and how our brain is making predictions about reality according to like past experience, and how essentially this will lead to what the Buddhists might call suffering or inaccuracies in our predictions about reality, which create the kind of friction and unhappiness. I wonder, would you theorize, like, do you feel that it's causing tension in you when that happens, or do you feel that it's actually the brain is using up more oxygen, or is it both, a combination of two? I think probably the science is still out on that, but I'm curious what you would theorize.
The brain might be using more oxygen, but I think probably the more critical effect of it is just the tension it creates, and also the changes it makes to your nervous system and the hormones that are released because of that. So if you are thinking about a potential future that's negative, like a blackout or a failure, then that's going to cause cortisol production or maybe even adrenaline production, and that's going to activate also the sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight. Your heart rate's going to go up, so you're using more of your resources, and you're then that nervous system activation will also influence you physically. So it will cause you to change the way that you're breathing. You're more likely to then overbreathe, which is a big danger in freediving. So breathing at a higher respiratory rate, which doesn't help you with more oxygen, but it does off-gas more CO2, and we need the CO2 in order to trigger the mammalian dive response in order to conserve oxygen. So there's this kind of like carry-on effect whereby, if you think a negative thought, have a reaction to that, activate the sympathetic nervous system, now you're breathing different, now you're off-gassing more CO2, now you're going to be less oxygen efficient in the dive itself. And there's multiple different pathways like that where the mental state can influence the actual physiology of the dive itself.
Thank you so much for listening so far. I just wanted to take a quick moment to jump in and give you an update from the FitMind team. So we recently launched an incredible new course, which is free in the app, which is the preferred approach, and also on YouTube. It's called 30 Days of Meditation, Science and Bliss. And this has combined what we feel is the most effective contemplative practices with what we feel is the most important, the science. Honestly, I can't believe the course is free. It's genuinely incredible and has changed my life. Also, FitMind recently transitioned to an NGO. So if there is any way that you can help us at all, we now survive entirely off donations. And even if you can't afford to help out financially, if you could just give us a like or share this podcast, or the course with anyone that it might help. Our goal here is simply just to help as many people as we can. We thank you so much. Now back to the episode. Yeah, I think that's a really important point that you raised, because a lot of current breath work and a lot of the way I might see spear fishermen dive around me is they would do a kind of Wim Hof, or they would be reducing their CO2, which increases the risk of blackouts, in my understanding. So yeah, I'm glad that you raised that. And you mentioned the mammalian dive reflex. For anyone that doesn't know what that is, could we explore that a little bit?
Yeah, it's a set of reflexes, a set of physiological changes that happen in the body that all have the goal or the effect of conserving oxygen. So the biggest and most important one is this concept of shifting the blood from your extremities into your core. If you look at a muscle in your arm, if you tie a tourniquet around your arm, so there's no blood flow and hence no oxygen in that arm, you can continue using your arm for probably, depending on the level of activity, like the amount of force you're using, minutes or more. Same with your leg. So your muscles don't actually need oxygen all the time. They can use anaerobic pathways, which creates lactic acid, and they can also use creatine. And so, yeah, oxygen isn't essential for your periphery, but it is essential for your core and for your brain. So your brain cannot survive like even a second if you're able to like push a carotid here and stop the blood flow to your brain. You black out instantly because your brain cannot cope with no blood flow and no oxygen. And so it makes sense for your body to conserve the oxygen for the organs that cannot survive, cannot cope without it. And so you get this shunt of all the blood being pushed by peripheral vasoconstriction, like shutting down all the blood vessels, pushed into the core, into the lungs, the heart, and the brain. And that means that you're conserving oxygen because your muscles are now not using oxygen as what's the word, like the part that combusts in a energetic reaction. It's using anaerobiosis instead of aerobiosis. So no oxygen is being consumed by the muscles, so it's conserved for the heart and the brain. And that's just one piece of the mammalian dive reflex. It's probably the most important one, but you also have other stuff like bradycardia, heart slows down, the spleen contracts, releases this like fresh bonus of red blood cells into circulation, the metabolism slows down, the Bohr effect, which is where you can get access to the oxygen that's stored in your red blood cells more readily. So multiple different components that all have this common effect of conserving oxygen for the brain, basically.
And this is, to my understanding, this is the same process a dolphin or a whale would go through, to the best of our knowledge. Is that correct?
It is, yeah. They have a much more enhanced, a much more, what's the word, consummate dive reflex than we do. So, for instance, like a blue whale, I think they've measured their heart rates down to 7 beats per minute. And seals, some of the seals will go down into the teens, 12, 15 beats a minute. The lowest I've ever measured mine, I've never measured it in a very deep dive, but I know it can go into like the high 20s.
Wow.
But yeah, the seals in particular have an incredible amount of other adaptations like myoglobin concentration in the muscles, a very strong shunt of the blood out of those muscles. So they're much better equipped, and they can hold their breath for, in some cases, like over an hour under the water. I think in the case of Weddell seals and elephant seals, they can manage like up to an hour. And there's some whales, like the Cuvier's beaked whale, I think, has held its breath for a couple of hours and gone to like 2 or 3 kilometers under the sea. So yeah, we're far behind. But when you think that we've managed to, I don't know, go to 100 meters in the space of one lifetime, whereas these animals have been evolving for millions of years, then it does give us a little bit more cause for feeling good about ourselves. But yeah, we're newbies in the water.
You mentioned the Bohr effect briefly. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? I understand that's like relatively, at least there's been more evidence recently. And correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, it's pretty scientifically concrete now, and it's one of the reasons why, for instance, yeah, the Wim Hof method in terms of breath work isn't a good approach for holding your breath. And basically, it's the idea that the red blood cells, which carry the oxygen from your lungs to everywhere else in your body, they kind of are a little bit choosy about when to give up the oxygen that they're carrying. And it depends on the acidity, the pH of the environment that they find themselves in. So if it's very alkaline, they'll hang on to their oxygen. If it's very acidic, then they'll give it up. And because the thing that determines the acidity, the pH of your blood is the carbon dioxide. The more CO2 you have dissolved in your blood, it dissolves with water and forms carbonic acid, which increases the acidity. And so the less, if you've off-gassed all your CO2 through hyperventilation or some kind of aggressive breath work, then your blood will be more alkaline, and it won't reach the same levels of acidity during the breath hold, and so you won't get access to all of the oxygen that's stored in your red blood cells. So this is why in my courses and talks, I talk about CO2 being your friend. Like CO2 is actually the gas, even though it's the off gas, the waste gas, and the gas that gives you the urge to breathe. It's also the gas that allows you to access your oxygen stores in your blood, and that triggers the mammalian dive reflex. So CO2 in combination with a breath hold gives you all of that oxygen conservation, and it gives you access to the blood, the oxygen in your blood. So yeah, it's really important. The tricky thing is that when you hold your breath, as I said, the CO2 gives you that urge to breathe. And so if you've gotten rid of it, it feels easier to hold your breath. It feels like, I could do this forever. And then you black out because you don't get the urge to breathe and because you haven't been able to access your oxygen stores. So the more difficult route, but the longer one in the long run, like the one that will get you better results in the long run, is via kind of embracing the CO2. So not over-breathing, not off-gassing all that CO2, and you'll feel the urge to breathe earlier, but you will also go into oxygen conservation mode earlier, and you'll be safer, and you'll have access to all of the oxygen in your blood. So it's a case of kind of taking 2 or 3 steps back and then ultimately taking 4 or 5 or more forwards, but it's a really important one, especially at the beginning of freediving. Not going down that route of the shortcut with Wim Hof or hyperventilation.
That is very counterintuitive, actually. You just kind of assume early on before any training that more oxygen. So it's really, yeah, it's amazing to hear like that there is really in-depth science showing that that's not the case.
Yeah, the easiest way to dispel that kind of intuition is to think, if you've been to hospital, they put the oxygen saturation meter clipped onto your finger, and unless you're really like critically ill with like serious COVID or something, then your oxygen saturation is going to be like 98, 99%. And that's when you're not doing anything. You're just lying there watching the TV or something. And so if you say to someone, okay, for all intents and purposes, your oxygen saturation is 100%, try and increase that. Like, what can you do to increase that? And they might huff and puff and hyperventilate, but obviously 100% is 100%. You cannot, it's like this bottle. Like, if it's 100% full, how much more water can you put into it? Nothing, right? Our
Right.
blood is the same. Once it's saturated, you cannot go past 100% saturation. And that's the key concept. There's no amount of breathing that is going to influence your oxygen saturation in your blood. And all it's going to do is reduce carbon dioxide. So don't think about breathing as oxygenating, because that's not what it's doing. Like, you can do that with the most minimal, passive, marginal breath. All that the additional breathing it's doing is getting rid of the CO2.
For me, there is no feeling like free diving, like, because you are at least for me, before a dive I would be quite excited, but then, as you've described, the physiological response is generally that your heart rate will slow, and all of the other effects. So during a dive, you tend to get calmer, even though there is some exertion and um, presence, vibrancy, and I think for me, there's still like quite a lot of excitement. Does that translate for you? I imagine you would have that happen even more, particularly on a good dive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's testimony to the power of the dive reflex, because it seems like the dive reflex trumps everything. It trumps even the fight or flight reflex. It trumps, like, if you've had a cup of strong coffee and you've got like a high heart rate, as soon as you start a dive, it's going to still drop just the same. So anything else that's happening, the dive reflex seems to be able to override that. So if you are, agitated before, it's obviously it's not optimum, because there's other different reasons why, like we talked about before, you don't want to be stressed or agitated before a dive, but all the same, the dive reflex will take that away during the dive itself. So yeah, that's a very common effect. And even if something happens, that's like, I've had dives where at 100 meters I've collided with the bottom plate, and like to the point where I've kind of gashed my head. But you stay calm in those situations. Like, I'm coming up and my safety diver's looking at me strange because he can see the blood pouring down my face. But in that moment, you're kind of supremely calm, and that overrides anything else that happens. So it's really amazing to see that come out in the body.
It reminds me, actually, yeah, even if I have quite a stressful, I still feel very uncomfortable with CO2, at least when I haven't been diving a lot. And even if it's quite an uncomfortable dive, the effect afterwards would be, or even during, the kind of default that might take sometimes a few days on like a retreat to quieten down the monkey mind, as you mentioned before. It tends to happen anyway, even during a stressful, what I would consider a stressful dive, where it's quite challenging and there's a lot of noise. The effect afterwards or during is still that. And I remember I would drive home from the pool and listen to classical FM, and it was such a peak experience. I was just like, lights were brighter, everything was like actually a little bit more vibrant, I found. I asked a few people at the club about that, whether they experienced that, and a few people didn't. Well, most people said they didn't. Is that something you've ever experienced? It was at night, and it was just like lights were just a little bit brighter.
Yeah, I've definitely had those kind of experiences, especially early on in my freediving. I remember some sessions that I would do, for instance, like doing breath holds and pranayama work, which is a kind of a form of yogic breath hold. And I'd be sitting on a deck, like looking out across the sea towards the sunrise and the sunset. And when I finished the session, which I'd do pretty much with my eyes closed the whole time, after half an hour, I'd open my eyes, and it just felt like everything was just kind of crystalline. Like, there was so much more clarity, but also definition, and just, a different kind of visual experience, as well as the smells and the feeling of the breeze on your skin, like everything was so much more vivid. And that's one of the types of kind of enhanced or elevated experiences that I've had that I would attribute to freediving or freediving training. Sure, yeah.
Interesting. I have had a similar-ish experience after about 7 days on a retreat, meditating 10 hours a day, but that was after like a 1.5 hour session. So yeah, it's a really interesting, it's an interesting effect.
And in general, I feel like freediving is kind of like a hack or a cheat code that gets you to those states so much quicker than other practices. Whereas in a freedive, 30 seconds, a minute, and you can be right there, and to a depth that exceeds what I've ever experienced, at least on the mat. So the possibilities for those kind of experiences and the ease with which they come and the repeatability in freediving is incredible.
You've pushed your body to the absolute limits of human endurance. What has this taught you about like perceived limitations of the human body, and how much of it is a mental game? And I'd love to touch on relaxation as well. I know it's like a very core component of freediving.
Yeah, in terms of limits, it's an interesting one because it's the same thing that happens in every sport, right? Like whenever someone imposes a limit on the sport or on themselves, then there's someone else who comes along who's gonna surpass that. And I remember when I started freediving, the record at the time in the discipline I specialize in was 60 meters. And I kind of felt like the guy who's had set that record, he was a triathlete, but he'd only been training freediving for maybe 2 or 3 years in order to achieve that record. And so I thought, okay, well, if someone dedicated themselves like for 10 years or longer, then surely with the same technique, they should be able to go significantly deeper. So I was already thinking that there was a potential for more. Back then I was no one. I was just like a 30, 40 meter diver. But I set this goal for myself. Okay, I want to be able to dive to 250 feet, 76 meters by the time I'm 25. And I reached that goal, but by then another freediver, a very strong Czech freediver, Martin Stepanek, had done 80 meters. And at that time, everyone thought, okay, there's no way that record's going to be broken because he just like blasted it to smithereens. But I looked at the video and I was like, hang on a second, he doesn't have perfect technique here. So if someone else trained as hard as he did and improved on his technique, then surely more is possible. And so then I set this idea, okay, I'm going to try and get to 300 feet by my 30th birthday. The idea of like 300 feet, 2 bare feet, 1 breath of air. And it was kind of like my motivational mantra. And yeah, ultimately I reached that goal. So I broke his record and then got to 300 feet and carried on to 100 meters or 102. But if you'd told me back when the record was 60, 61, like if you'd asked me what is the human limit in this discipline, back then, even with fins, we hadn't gone past, I think, 86 meters or maybe 90. So the idea of 100 meters with no fins would have just been laughable. And we see that time and time again in freediving and in other sports and activities. And so, yeah, a limitation is only going to be an artificial boundary. It's not written anywhere. And obviously, I mean, there's just this kind of like, there's black and white. We know that we can do 102 meters. We know that we'll never be able to dive to 200 meters, no fins. And I think you could probably even say that about like 120 or 130 meters. Those are black. But there's this gray area between 103 to more. That's just kind of increasingly more difficult, increasingly less likely. And it's our job to mine that gray area, to try and extend as deep as possible, as far as possible, into that unknown zone. So whenever I'm asked, like, what do you think the limit is? I'll never give a number. I'll just say, okay, there's this gray area that's beyond 102, and somewhere in there is a limit, but we'll never know what it is.
Where are you at now with your training? Are you currently looking to further that depth?
I would like to, and it needs kind of a few ducks to come in a row, because for the last several years I've been kind of starting a family, and that really does upend your world in many different ways. As well as that, we've had COVID, and because of COVID and the financial crisis, I lost most of my sponsors. And so there's been a lot that's gone down in the last 4 or 5 years. And now I just feel like I've finally come back to a point where I'm able to dedicate myself a little more to training, but I still have this responsibility of the family to provide for. So I'm trying to find a way to set myself up so that I can concentrate fully on training. And yeah, it would require me to have at least kind of like a year and a half of clean time to focus mostly on that, in order to get back to those depths and think about maybe extending them. And I'm conscious of my age now. I'm 45, and so I know that we don't have like another 10, 15 years of this. But I would like to really try and see what else is still in the bag, in the tank, in these last few years.
What's the future of freediving science? Is there any new technologies or research areas that you're super excited about?
Yeah, it's a interesting one, because it's a sport that has a very complex science, but the technology is fairly simple, especially in no fins. Like, there's nothing. There's your wetsuit, and I feel like the orca suit that I wear now is pretty much the pinnacle of that technology. I can't think of any ways to improve on it, and that's the only thing that I use that influences performance. So it then all comes down to the technique of the dive and the training that you do. And even there, I feel like there's definitely still room for improvement, I'm sure. But we're training pretty smart these days, and very hard. And so, well, I think, we're not going to see huge jumps in the way that we have in the last 20 years, I don't think. And maybe I'll eat my words with that, but at least we've definitely seen a slowdown in the last, like, if you think in the last 10 years, the depth hasn't really improved at all in no fins, whereas the 10 years before that, it improved from kind of 80 to 100. So we've slowed down, and we've slowed down in the other disciplines as well. There may still be more gains to be had, but it's going to be more difficult, I think, to add meters at this point.
Yeah, agreed. I saw, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but I think it was in New Zealand. Well, the first part actually is just, for some reason, freediving, every event or gathering I've been to, has an abnormal amount of doctors or scientists, I find. So there is quite a passionate, like, scientific community that seems to do a lot of grassroots science, almost like it's a kind of unpaid, at least from the bits that I've seen. But there was, and it might have been the Bohr effect, where they had the divers at like down to 70 meters. I think it was a lake in New Zealand, and they were taking blood of a diver at each of the the stops. So they took blood at 70, which must be the deepest the deepest anyone's given blood before.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with that team. I was actually on a call with them just a couple of days ago, because we're going to repeat that experiment slightly deeper in the Caribbean. So, and with more divers. But the subject of that experiment was Dave Mullins, who's another Kiwi, very competent freediver, and has the depth record, I think, with the monofin, 125 meters. And set multiple records in the pool. So yeah, that was a really interesting research that they were doing in order to find out the concentrations of gases in the blood at depth. And the only way to really accurately do that was to take a sample. So he had like a catheter in his arm that he went down with, and then they drew a sample of blood at that depth. He came back up to the surface, and even before he took his first breath, they were taking another sample of blood on the surface. So, yeah, pretty invasive and intensive studies, but revealing a lot about the physiology of the sport.
Could they measure like blood oxygen after a dive like that? I'm curious what it does.
Absolutely. So they're measuring, in that one, they were measuring the oxygen, the pressure of oxygen in the blood, and finding, I think, that it did increase during the dive, which was expected. And from that, they also started to ask the question about the concentrations of other gases. And I think that's going to be the subject of new research in the future.
We mentioned earlier about breath work. A lot of our listeners will struggle with anxiety or high pressure situations. What sort of techniques would you recommend for those people? And yeah, if there is a short practice we could do, that would be awesome as well.
Absolutely. So the interesting thing about freediving, as we touched on before, is that it is this kind of test tube experiment in extreme stress management. In other sports, take boxing, sprinting, you can channel that stress or that adrenaline, that nervousness, the anxiety that you have, you can channel it all into the performance itself. Because if you're getting fired up, if you're getting a faster heart rate, if you're getting more blood being pushed to your periphery, to your muscles, that all benefits your performance. But not so in freediving, and also not so in day-to-day life. Like if we're stressed in the boardroom, if we come home and we walk into an argument with the family, in these situations where we are under pressure in our day-to-day lives, it also doesn't help to have the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight, cortisol, adrenaline, these stress hormones, to have that activated, because it subdues the prefrontal cortex, so you don't reason as well. It sends more blood to the amygdala, which is your emotive part of your brain, and many other different effects. And so freediving is kind of a mirror for the way that we would want to respond to stress in our day-to-day lives. And the techniques that I kind of had to develop in order to be successful in freediving in a world record attempt or competition, they work so well also in these other versions of stress and pressure. And so basically what I've done is kind of transcribe these techniques, mental and physical, into a system that can be used by anyone without, you don't have to go in the water or freedive or hold your breath even, but you can access the potential of the breath itself, in particular one breathing muscle, and the mind, in order to remain in a place of calmness, what I call smiling into the abyss, like to look into that chaos, that inferno, and to stay inside, calm, serene, and level-headed, essentially. So yeah, I can take you through kind of like a quick version of that. We'd maybe focus on the breathing, which is typically the easiest one to pick up. Basically, the most important thing is to figure out where you are breathing, like which muscles you are using to breathe, because the muscles of the diaphragm, which is this kind of like, if you imagine like an upside down salad bowl in your torso, and the fibers, they overlap like any muscle fibers, and so when they contract, they shorten, and that salad bowl becomes a plate which pulls down, creates negative pressure, and pulls air into the lungs. That's how you breathe into your belly with your diaphragm. And that muscle, when these fibers contract, they have stretch receptors that send a signal to the brain to tell the brain to activate the parasympathetic nervous system, which is your calming, rest and digest, it's called. It's like the calm state that you would go into while you're sleeping. And in fact, this is the way that we breathe when we're asleep. If you watch a baby, especially, they're only breathing into the belly. So when you breathe with the diaphragm, that muscle contracts, and as it contracts, it pushes the belly out. So it looks like you're inflating your stomach because the diaphragm is pushing down. And then it relaxes and the air comes out again. So if you're side on, you'll see, let me see if I can do this. You'll see no movement in the chest and only movement in the belly. So inhale, exhale.
Yeah, and if you put your hand on it, you should be able to feel that for anyone listening.
Exactly. So the hand on the chest doesn't move at all. But there's another style of breathing, which is called thoracic, where you breathe using your intercostal muscles to expand the rib cage. And it kind of feels like, well, it is gasping. So when you breathe into the thorax, typically through the mouth, this part expands and is raised, and the belly stays in. And if you breathe like that, if you try it, you'll probably straight away feel kind of like a state of agitation or anxiety that starts to build up. And that's because the stretch receptors in these muscles send a signal to the brain to activate the sympathetic nervous system, which is fight or flight, adrenaline, cortisol. So literally by changing the muscles that you use for breathing, you can reverse engineer your central nervous system state. And you can select between, do I want to be activated and fight or flight, or for this situation, do I want to be calm, serene, and have more blood flowing through my decision-making prefrontal cortex? And in 9 times out of 10, that's the better system to be using, right? Like if you're in an argument with your spouse, if you're in a difficult job interview, if you're having to stand up and talk, public speaking, or play an instrument in front of a crowd, like any time where you are facing pressure, stress, anxiety, it is better to have parasympathetic nervous system activation as much as possible. So just the style of breathing is a reverse hack, a reverse engineer of that central nervous system state. So if everyone can just, again, put one hand on the chest, one hand on the stomach, and you should feel that hand on the stomach breathe, move out and in with each inhale and exhale. The hand on the chest stays still. And the next thing to check is that you're breathing through your nose. There's many different, I don't think we've got time to list out all the different benefits for nasal breathing. But whenever you want to be more relaxed, more in control, then make sure that you are breathing through the nose. In fact, there's very few occasions where mouth breathing is indicated. The mouth is designed for eating, chewing, biting, whereas the nose has like a filtration system to warm and filter the air. It releases nitrous oxide into the airflow, which then has follow-on effects in the lungs. So yeah, nasal breathing is really important. And so we're breathing through the nose into the belly. And the last thing to talk about is just the rhythm of the breathing. So what we're going to do now is just, if everyone goes back to that position, breathing in through the nose into the belly. And after the exhale, I'd invite you just to have a pause that could be a couple of seconds, could be a little longer. Just a pause after the exhale in emptiness. And I call this the 3-second gap, though it doesn't have to be 3 seconds. But it's just a gap between the exhale and the following inhale. And in that moment of emptiness, of silence, you're going to ask yourself, I wonder what my next thought is going to be. And after asking that question, just watch and wait. And you might find that, and you can continue breathing, you might find that there's a gap. It's almost like your mind, your brain gets stage fright when you ask it, what am I going to think about next? There's kind of like this moment of complete emptiness. And in that emptiness, then you experience this state of kind of being awareness, but with no contents to the awareness. And that's a window into the second half of the mental immune system, which is what I call observer mind, pure consciousness. But it also sets you up for being in control of your thoughts and what you're going to think about next. So you can select the kind of direction you're going to go. Like maybe a thought pops into your mind that's basically like a worry about something that's going to happen tomorrow, or a replay of like a shitty situation or an argument that you had in the morning. And then you can say, okay, no, I don't want to, I choose not to entertain that thought. Okay, I'm going to wait for the next one. And you do that, repeat that process until you find a train of thought that you want to pursue. And so it puts you in control of this kind of process of choosing where you want to place your attention. And that potential is opened by this gap, by this kind of moment of emptiness after the exhale, before the inhale. So inhale, exhale, and then 3 seconds, could be 2, could be 4, whatever. And in that emptiness, you're kind of preparing yourself for that next breath, which is also going to be nasal diaphragmatic. So you continue to activate the parasympathetic nervous system, and you're preparing yourself for where you're going to put your attention next. And there's physiological reasons for having the pause after the exhale as opposed to after the inhale. Won't go into those, but this style of breathing can be implemented in any scenario. So it's not something that like it's going to get you weird looks if you start doing it during a meeting, for instance. You can be doing this while you're talking, while you're listening, and no one would ever know. It would look actually completely natural and serene and calm. And at the same time, it's having that effect on you. So it's such a powerful tool that can be used at any moment. And then what I'll finish with is that the last part of the mental immune system is that all of this, the physical component, the breath, and also the mental components, the observer mind that we haven't gone into, all of it can actually be programmed into your subconscious mind. So it becomes a reflex in the same way that my body has that reflex to being underwater. So whenever you find yourself in a high pressure situation, stressful, anxiety inducing, then you can have this automatic reflex that doesn't require you to remember anything or to think about anything. It just happens as a reflex and dictates how your central nervous system is activated and how calm and how rational and level-headed you are. And there will be situations where I find myself, basically, I notice that my breathing has changed and my kind of mental state has changed. And then I notice that it's a pretty shitty situation that I'm in, like shit's going bad, right? And so that's the kind of the proof to me that it's become a subconsciously governed reflex, because I don't actually realize that I'm using these techniques until after I discover that, until after I discovered that it's a bad situation. So once you reach that point, then it's life changing for me, at least, because you're not going to be kind of at the mercy of this what is essentially like a primordial reflex. Because back in the day, you go back 10,000, 20,000 years, yes, this fight or flight reflex, most of the times when we're stressed or anxious, it will help us. Like if you're walking down the mountain path and you hear a noise, or you come face to face with a cave lion, a cave bear, or a mountain lion, then you need to be able to activate the fight or flight reflex, and so it has utility. Nowadays, we live in apartment buildings, and we go to work in sterile offices. We don't have that necessity. All the pressure, the anxiety that we experience is in the form of kind of like interpersonal stuff where we have to be able to stay calm. We have to be able to be in control. And so we need to upload to our subconscious this kind of software patch that says, okay, in this situation, don't go with sympathetic, go with parasympathetic. That's all. And do it with this kind of breathing and with this kind of mental approach. And once you've got that patch, you're good for life. Like it will self-reinforce itself, because it's the more that your subconscious sees that it works, the more that it's going to employ it in the future.
You mentioned the mental immune system. For anyone that doesn't know what that is, what is that, and how do we find out more?
Yeah, so basically everything that I was harping on about for the last 5 minutes, that is the mental immune system. It's this kind of distillation of the techniques that I've used in freediving for high pressure situations, which is what freediving is. It's this test tube experiment in stress management. Because like, if you can imagine, there's been record attempts I've had where I'm lying there, I'm trying to relax as much as possible, and I'm taking my last breath, literally the breath of oxygen or air that's got to sustain me for this round trip, 200 meters. And as I'm taking that breath, this voice comes into my head: this is the last breath you're going to take. And like, what do you do with that? In that moment, you're committed, you have to go, but you have to be able to deal with that thought, or at least prevent it from having an impact on you. And so that's where these techniques come from and why they are so powerful. And so the mental immune system is these two halves: the mental side, the observer mind, and the physical side, which is revolves around specific methods of breathing and using the breath as a reverse engineer for the central nervous system state. So the mental and the physical halves, and then programming those into the subconscious, into your kind of like brain stem, so that it's not something that you have to remember to do. Because in the heat of the moment, what do we do? Like if you walk back into the house and your spouse like has had a bad day, you've had a bad day, and someone gets triggered and you're off to the races. Like in that moment, we just go back to whatever we're programmed with, or however we're hardwired. And so unless it is a reflex to that kind of a situation, it's never going to work. You can't say, okay, let me do this style of breathing. Okay, I've got to breathe in for 4 seconds, out for 8 seconds, and roll my tongue and put my hand like this. It's never going to work. So this is something that you can program into the subconscious, because it's simple enough. And there's a specific kind of pathway in order to ingrain it into the subconscious.
I'll put a link to that in the section below as well. So at FitMind, we emphasize that the practice, or the meditation practice, should be enjoyable. How do you find joy in such a demanding and what's often uncomfortable sport? I know you touched on it briefly earlier, but yeah, how do you do that when you're diving to depths of 100 meters?
Yeah, really interesting, good question, because the sensations that we experience when we're holding our breath, a lot of the time they're described as kind of suffering or pain. It's not really pain in a sense, because it doesn't come via pain receptors, but it's this kind of existential pain or crisis or just urgency, a sense of urgency that engulfs you, right? And it's one of the most intense sensations I think you can experience. Maybe the only thing worse would be like getting burned alive, perhaps. Like drowning, I think would be up there. Um, and so like, how do you then, in order to perform, be okay with that? And not just okay, but not let it impact you, and be able to relax into it, like leaning into it. And essentially that's what most of my training is about kind of moving towards that sensation rather than away from it. We talked before about CO2 and how important it is to embrace the CO2 in order to perform, even though the CO2 is what gives you the urge to breathe. And it's the same thing. That intensity of the urge to breathe is necessary for performance. And so we have to find a way to make peace with it. And this is actually unlocks kind of the second half, the mental part of the mental immune system, because there is a way to see everything that happens to you, including those sensations, no matter how intense, and including the most horrible negative thoughts or emotions that you can experience. There is a way to see all of that as data or contents to your awareness. So basically the story that's happening, the contents that is happening and being displayed to your awareness. And you, the only you, the real you, is just the awareness. It's just the receiver of that. It's not the sensation itself. It's not the emotion, the thoughts that are triggered, because those thoughts, you're not actually thinking them. And scientifically, this can be proven as well. We're experiencing our thoughts. We're just listening to them in the same way that you're listening to my voice. Your thoughts actually happen as a result of biochemical reactions in your brain moments before you experience them. And so the result is then displayed to your consciousness and you experience that, but it's just contents. And so putting everything into this one basket of contents to your awareness is that's what I call the observer mind, just observing it all and being the awareness itself. And it's an incredibly powerful technique that allows you to detach in those moments when that urge to breathe is at its peak, when your lungs are screaming out for oxygen, basically. And yeah, it's in the long run, I think it's the only way to really excel in the sport and to be able to perform to your potential, is by taking this route where you kind of embrace those sensations.
That's interesting. It reminds me of Mingyur Rinpoche. He's a Tibetan or Nepalese monk, and he would talk about like welcoming discomfort. He used to have panic attacks when he was younger, and I think that translates so well to other like situations as well. But yeah, he was having panic attacks when he was a child, and then ended up sitting in a room for a few days. But he just began welcoming it, so he just went into full acceptance. And then he talks about how the panic never came around anymore after just a couple of days. So yeah, it's so interesting, the correlation and the similarities between what you're doing, which I think is like a really intense and quick version of like potentially like some mental afflictions or suffering.
Yeah, so to get back to your original comment about like always looking for the joy in meditation, and I would say that that's the same in freediving, but with a caveat, which is that in order to get to that point, you sometimes have to go through the not joy, let's put it mildly, and you have to make peace with that, because it's part of the same whole thing, right? They're two sides of the same coin, the suffering, the happiness, the black and the white, the life and death. And so you cannot have one without the other. So in order to have the joy you have to also embrace the difficulty. And the motto that I use in my training with my students is train hard, dive easy. And it's kind of the same thing, because through training at this high level and putting yourself in this high state of CO2 and discomfort, then ultimately you will get to the point where you'll be able to do these effortless, beautiful dives to very deep depths, and you won't feel those strong sensations. You'll feel, or they'll just feel kind of normal, like you'll be adapted to it. But the way through is the way, is the discomfort, the intensity, the training.
That seems to have a profound effect on the nervous system as well, at least out of the water, from what I've experienced too. There's some sort of processing going on, I think, that is helpful with those kind of somatic sensations or experiences. Yeah. So as we start to wrap up, I'll do we'll finish up with a quick fire round. So usually we'll just do short 1-sentence answers. So what's your favorite place to dive in the world?
Deansville Hole has to be. It's the best place in the world. It's like a 200-meter deep swimming pool.
Yeah, I've listened to you and read you talk about it quite extensively, and it just to anyone that doesn't know, actually, maybe we do briefly dive into the competition that you founded there.
Yeah, we started with Vertical Blue, which is the name of the competition we hold here, in 2008. It's the longest running, most prestigious competition. Probably more than half of the world records that have been set in the last 15 years set in Vertical Blue. And it's the New York Times calls it the Wimbledon of freediving.
Yeah, it's incredible, and they have the dives are on YouTube for anyone that's interested. It's a very, very unique place from what I've seen, and I hope to get there at some point. So what's one book that has had a profound impact on you?
One?
We can give 2 or 3.
Let's go with Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse.
Nice.
Because it's a very short read. It's a book that I haven't read it in a while, but there was a period where I'd read it at least once every year. So I must have read it maybe half a dozen times. And it's just so profound, and it actually kind of, there's a couple of little snippets in it that confirmed, to me at least, that I was kind of on the right track with what I was doing in freediving and training. So yeah, it has kind of a lot of personal importance for me.
Amazing. Yeah, good choice. And if you weren't a freediver, what would you be?
You got me on that one. I have no idea. Maybe an alpinist. Maybe I'd be in the mountains instead. I love being in the mountains. I don't have any talent there, so probably wouldn't have been a very good one. But I feel like it would have been something outdoors, because I can't imagine myself. I worked for a year. I graduated in genetics, worked for a year as a genetic engineer in New Zealand before I went traveling. And it was interesting. It's cutting edge science, but you're working in a laboratory all day with substances you cannot see, doing pretty repetitive tasks. And it just wasn't my cup of tea. Like I'm fascinated by the science, but more as an observer rather than as a participant now.
And what's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
The one that pops into my mind now, I'm not sure if this is the best. Well, it's actually a piece of advice that an old friend gave me in my dream. So it was in the first year that I was freediving, and he appeared in my dream, and he just said the words, "Stand in your dream." And I think he he repeated them a couple of times. But it was such a vivid experience. It was one of those dreams where you wake up and you're like, did that actually just happen? Like, there's something different about that dream. Was he just here? Like, what's going on? And back then there was no, well, I was on some tiny little island in Honduras. So the next day I went into a bigger island where there was an internet cafe and sent him an email saying, hey, Damien, is everything okay? Because I just had this dream that's really freaky where it felt like you were right there in the room with me. And he was fine. But that piece of advice seemed so relevant at the time, and then in the years that came, because it solidified the path that I was on and gave me more courage to persist with it, and confirmation that I was on the right track, that I was doing the right thing for myself at that moment. So yeah, stand in your dream.
Amazing. And final question, if you could describe the feeling of a perfect dive in one word.
One word, it's kind of a little bit of a cliche, but maybe harmony. If you allow me 3 words, then
Absolutely.
the words I would choose are peace, precision, and power, because those are the 3 elements that have to come together. Peace is relaxation, precision is the technique, the power is the kind of the will and also the strength. Those 3 elements coming together can lead to a perfect free dive.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Will. I honestly, for me, and I am a little bit biased, but yeah, good dive into 102 meters without fins, I think is up there with the greatest human feats that that we're aware of. I think it's incredible. So yeah, I really appreciate it, and thank you from the audience, and hope you have a great day.
It's been fun.
Thank you so much for listening to the episode. If you enjoyed it, please, if you could give us a like, a subscribe, and hit the notification bell, that would really help us out. Or just share this episode with a friend, share the course with a friend. Anything would go such a long way. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you soon.